and gentlemen, welcome to episode 4 of our ongoing podcast series, The Perils Facing the African Continent. If you have been following our discussions, you will recall that in the last episode, we discussed current crises, wars, conflicts, and myriads of other challenges that continue to threaten the survival of states in Africa. A continent we agreed was of vast potential, yet burdened with debt, plagued by weak institutions and extreme poverty. This raises important questions. Was Africa always a continent in crisis? The answer is a resounding no. How did we then get here? That is what the next 4 episodes of this series will attempt to answer. In today's episode, titled An Early History of a Vibrant and Flourishing Africa, we embark on a historical journey that tells the real story of Africa prior to its disruption by the arrival of the Europeans. Louis Leakey in 1961, and Louis Leakey was a renowned anthropologist, while discussing the progress and evolution of man in Africa, states that, I quote, "Men of science today are, with few exceptions, satisfied that Africa was the birthplace of man himself, and that for many hundreds of centuries thereafter, Africa was in the forefront of all world progress," unquote. Then Kwame Nkrumah, in his book, Africa Must Unite, in 1963, asks the question, what kind of people, what kind of cities did these plunderers, he meant the Europeans, find as they came to Africa? The answer came from an English historian, Basil Davidson, in his book, Old Africa Rediscovered, 1959. Davidson, adducing evidence from authentic records of the time, states that they anchored in havens. Havens in this case refers to ports that were thick with ocean shipping. And using they, he refers to the Europeans. They went ashore to cities as fine as all that, but a few they could have known in Europe. They watched a flourishing maritime trade and saw that they had stumbled on a world of commerce even larger and perhaps wealthier than anything that was witnessed in Europe. From this discussion, the narrative that Africa was a dark continent waiting to be discovered is not just misleading, but also a deliberate erasure of Africa's grandeur. You realize through this podcast that our ancestors built vast empires, established structured governance system, engaged in transcontinental trade, and nurtured centers of learning that drew scholars from around the world. Let me begin this journey by the Africa's powerful kingdoms. Africa had powerful kingdoms that were wealthy, had advanced governance, trade, and culture for thousands of years prior to the arrival of the white man. I'll just cite a few examples. You are all familiar with the ancient Egypt, a civilization that flourished along the Nile River in North Africa between 3150 and 30 BCE. Egypt is renowned for its monumental architecture, pyramids, sophisticated culture, agriculture, mathematics, hieroglyphic writings, and the concept of divine kingship, the idea of the pharaohs. Next is the kingdom of Kush, also known as Nubia, which was an ancient African kingdom centered in the Nile Valley, present-day northern Sudan and southern Egypt, that flourished around 1069 BCE to 350 CE. The kingdom is known for its trade, culture, and military prowess, even conquering and ruling Egypt as the 25th dynasty. The Kushites built grand pyramids that still stand today, showcasing their architectural mastery and engineering skills. The kingdom of Aksum, about the 1st century to 960 CE, in the present-day Horn of Africa and southern Arabia, which was considered one of the 4 great powers of the 3rd century alongside Persia, Rome, and China. This was according to a Persian prophet named Mani. Aksum, a wealthy African civilization, thrived for centuries, controlling a large territorial state and access to vast trade routes linking the Roman Empire to the Middle East and India. Similarly, there were kingdoms in other parts of Africa, such as the empires of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Benin, and Congo, among many others that time will not allow us to cover. But I just want to pose 2 quick questions. Did you know that African Moors conquered and ruled Spain for about 781 years, built universities and mosques in that region? Did you know that the most important Roman empire, Septimius Severus, was an African born in CE 145 in what is today Libya? He ruled the Roman Empire from AD 193 to 211 and made significant contribution in shaping the world. These few examples illustrate that Africa was home to highly developed civilizations long before European exploration. The continent's kingdoms were not isolated, primitive societies, but thriving centers of wealth, knowledge, and innovation. Their influence extended beyond Africa, shaping trade, governance, and culture in other parts of the world. By recognizing and celebrating these achievements, we can challenge the outdated narratives that have long represented Africa's rich history. Next, we look at trade networks that connected Africa to the rest of the world. Africa's trade networks were vast, sophisticated, and deeply connected to the global economy long before European intervention. The Swahili coast, which stretched across modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, bustled with ports such as Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar that thrived as commercial hubs where African traders exchanged gold, ivory, and spices for luxury goods like silk, ceramics, and glassware, which, as earlier stated, served as a vital link between Africa and major trade centers in the world. In North Africa, the trans-Saharan trade, facilitated by camel caravans, allowed for the movement of goods, ideas, and people across the vast desert landscape. Africa's trade relationship extended even further east, reaching as far as China. Historic records indicate that African giraffes were sent as diplomatic gifts to the Ming dynasty in 1414 CE, symbolizing the strong commercial and political ties between the two regions, that's Africa and China. The presence of African traders in Indian and Chinese ports suggests that Africa was not merely a recipient of foreign goods, but an active participant in shaping global trade dynamics. Third are the centers of learning that attracted attention across the world. Africa has been a center of intellectual achievement with thriving institutions of learning that attracted scholars from across the world. In Alexandria, Egypt, the Great Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, was one of the most significant libraries in the ancient world. Many great philosophers, including Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato, studied under African priests in Egypt, gaining knowledge that would later shape that in Europe. In Morocco, the House of Wisdom and Science, and what was later called the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, which was founded 859 CE, is considered as the world's oldest continuously operating university. Another renowned center of learning was Timbuktu, home to the University of Sankore and several other scholarly institutions. Established in 982 CE, it became one of the world's leading centers of higher education, drawing students and scholars from as far as Persia and Spain. At its peak, it enrolled up to 25,000 students and housed an extensive library with over 700,000 manuscripts covering a wide range of subjects. These institutions demonstrate that Africa was not only a recipient of knowledge but also a key contributor to global intellectual history. This historical reality challenges the misconception that civilization and education flowed only from Europe to Africa. Instead, Africa, as a leader in knowledge production and dissemination, with its ideas shaping the intellectual development of other parts of the world. Finally, we look at as a few examples of this skewed narrative on who really discovered Africa. The idea that Europeans discovered Africa is deeply flawed narrative rooted in propaganda rather than a historical fact. I'll only give 2 examples to demonstrate this. Long before Portuguese explorers like Prince Henry the Navigator, Bartholomew Dias, and Vasco da Gama started the process of exploring Africa, and it was said that Vasco da Gama is the one who discovered the spice route to India about 1498. African sailors, traders, and scholars had already mapped and navigated the continent's coastline and interiors. Historical records reveal that da Gama relied on the expertise of Ahmad ibn Majid, a renowned African navigator from the Sultanate of Malindi, to be able to successfully complete his journey to India. This challenges the Eurocentric portrayal of da Gama as a pioneering explorer and instead highlights the fact that Africans possessed the advanced maritime knowledge long before the Europeans. Secondly, the celebrated Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta extensively explored the world between 1325 and 1354 CE. He traveled for 29 years and covered about 75,000 miles, visiting the equivalent of 44 modern countries while documenting its rich civilizations, trade network, and cultural achievements. His travels, which took him all the way to India, China, Asia, and the rest of Africa, predated European expeditions by centuries. Yet history often overlooks these contributions in favor of European explorers who arrived much later. The notion that Africa was a land awaiting European discovery was a colonial construct designed to diminish African achievements and justify European dominance or domination. By framing Africa as an uncharted, primitive territory, this narrative deliberately erased the contribution of African scholars, navigators, and traders, stripping the continent of its historical agency. In reality, as we have realized, Africans were central to shaping world history for millennia through trade, innovation, and exploration. Recognizing and correcting these distortions is essential in restoring Africa's rightful place in world history. Kwame Nkrumah posed another critical question. When the Europeans came to Africa, what was happening in their own continent? And the answer to this is revealing. Europe was struggling through the dark ages between 5th to 15th century CE, struggling for almost 1,000 years. Europe was devastated by the Black Death, a bubonic plague pandemic between 1346 and 1353 CE, which decimated European populations, causing labor shortages and economic hardships. Europe was also going through numerous brutal internal and religious wars. You may need to look at where Europe was then and how Africa was, which we had earlier explained, which was more backward than the other. Seeking new sources of wealth, European nations turned their attention to Africa, drawn by its abundant resources and thriving economies. This marked the beginning of foreign interference that will eventually weaken Africa's political and economic systems. In conclusion, Africa was not a land waiting to be civilized. It was an already great set of empires, a great continent which set pace for others. Our kingdoms were powerful, our trade networks were vast, and our education systems were well renowned. Today, we must reclaim this history, challenge the distorted narratives, and strive for Africa that reflects its true legacy. As we conclude this episode, I invite you to join us in the next discussion, where we will get to look at and discuss deeply an example of a traditional African governance system, how it worked, and what it stood for, through a secondary podcast to this particular episode. Thereafter, we'll proceed with the other set of podcasts where we'll look at slavery and the period of slavery and colonialism as we build on this series. Thank you for tuning in. Let's keep the conversation going, because Africa's future depends on how well we understand its past. Thank you very much.